Translation era. Vanguards of translation. The truth is that Muslims at the beginning of Islam did not intend to transmit philosophy, and that did not concern them. Rather, they did not intend to transmit any science, and they did not take that into account. If any of these foreign sciences leaked to the Arabs, it was due to inevitable necessity and the result of the Arabs' contact with other neighboring nations. This contact occurred in the days of pre-Islamic times, but on a very narrow scale. Al-Harith bin Khalda al-Thaqafi learned medicine at the Jundisapur school in Persia, until he became known as the Arab doctor. It is narrated on the authority of Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas that he fell ill, so the Messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, visited him and said to him, "Go to Al-Harith bin Khalda, for he is a man who seeks medical care." However, the knowledge that Al-Harith acquired was not abundant, nor did he comprehend the origins of medical science and its branches in a scientific manner. Because this requires knowledge of the Syriac language to view the medical references that were transferred to that language and spread in Jundisapur, where Syriac doctors undertook this art. As for how medical science was transmitted to Jundisapur, and why it was translated from Greek into Syriac, this is a story that we would do well to tell. It is an ancient story that dates back to the time of Plato and Aristotle, the first of whom was interested in mathematics, and the second of whom was interested in physics and medicine. In addition, both of them were philosophers and school owners. The Hippocratic school of medicine also arose since ancient times, in the 3rd century BC. When the city of Alexandria was established, it became the seat of Greek civilization, and it was more scientific than philosophical, and Euclid, Gallius, Archimedes, Ptolemy, and other great scholars excelled in it, who established the foundations of sciences such as geometry, astronomy, and medicine. Alexandria remained a beacon shining with knowledge until the 6th century AD, and scholars from the second class appeared there, who arranged the books of the first-class scholars, refined them, and prepared them for teaching. From this second layer, the Arabs transmitted various sciences. Alexandria was not only concerned with science, but with all forms of culture, including religious, philosophical, and literary. In the first 3 centuries of AD, Pythagoreanism was renewed with its mathematical and ethical tendencies, and Platonism was renewed at the hands of Plotinus, Egyptian by birth and birth, Alexandrian by culture, Greek by language, and he was the author of the Enneads, in which he detailed the process of emanation from the One, and part of his book was translated into Arabic under the name of theology. The theory of emanation influenced many Muslim philosophers. His student, Porphyrius of Tyre, was no less influential than him in Islamic philosophy, and it is no wonder that he was the author of Isagoge, which was known to the Arabs by this Greek name until the present era. Isagoge means entrance, which is an introduction to Aristotle's categories. The science and philosophy that flourished in Alexandria until the 6th century AD fall under the title of Alexandrian philosophy, and most of what the Arabs learned was through them. This philosophy was not limited to the city of Alexandria only, but for historical reasons, since the 4th century AD, it headed towards the east and settled in cities. Sham, such as Ansh, Edessa, Nisibis, and Ras al-Ain. Christianity had achieved its victory over the paganism of the Greeks and Romans, and spread in Egypt, the Levant, and the Peninsula, and the Syriac Christians took on this Alexandrian philosophy, and transferred most of it to their tongue. However, Christianity remained in a bitter conflict with Greek philosophy for centuries, and Alexandria was the scene of this conflict. In it we find the paganism of the ancient Egyptians, the paganism of the Greeks represented in their myths, the paganism of the Romans, then Judaism philosophized by Philo of Alexandria in the 1st century, and the Christianity that was taken by Clement and Origen invading the cultural fields, along with Manichaeism coming from the Persians, which St. Augustine himself embraced for some time. Early in his youth, as stated in his Confessions, then the new Pythagoreanism that attempted to reconcile the various sects and religions, reconciliation that we find echoed in the letters of the Ikhwan ul-Safa. Thus, it can be said, Alexandria was the crucible in which various intellectual and religious trends from the East and West alike melted. The truth is that the ancient world was not isolated from one another, and human thought was scientific in most eras, and its progress is the progress of humanity itself. Indian and Persian doctrines influenced Alexandrian philosophy, just as they influenced Greek and Alexandrian philosophy in the East, and settled in the heart of Persia in the city of Jundisapur. This is because the wars between the Persians and the Romans are ancient, extending back in history to 5 centuries before Christ, and they were renewed from time to time. In the 3rd century, the Roman Emperor Valerian sent his son Gallienus to invade Persia. The Romans were defeated near Edessa, and the Persian army spread in the north of the Levant and plundered Ansh. Shapur transferred the Roman prisoners to a place near Tusta where he placed them. The place was called Jundisapur, meaning Shapur's camp. He treated the prisoners well, and left them the freedom to worship and establish churches for those who were Christians, and there were many engineers, builders, and doctors among them. Since about 260 AD, Jundisapur became the cradle of Greek science and medicine, until science and philosophy rose there again after the Emperor Justinian expelled the philosophers of the school of Athens, so he welcomed them. Khosrau in Jundisapur, where most of the sciences were transferred to Syriac, and some to Persian. It has been said that Ibn al-Mukaffar transferred Aristotle's logic from Persian. It seems that the first thing that the Arabs transmitted in Islam was the science of medicine, and that was at the time of the Umayyad Caliph Marwan ibn al-Hakam, 64–65 AH, when the Dr. Massijawayh transferred the book of Arhan ibn Ayn al-Qas on medicine from Syriac to Arabic, and the book remained preserved in bookcases. Until Omar bin Abdul Aziz took office in the year 99–101 AH, he asked God to take it out to the Muslims so that they could benefit from it, and placed it in his place of prayer. Arhan is a mysterious figure. It is said that he was from Alexandria. He lived in the 5th century. He wrote a book on medicine in 30 verses, which was translated into Syriac and then into Arabic. It is said in another narration that the first transfer in Islam was at the hands of Khalid bin Yazid al-Umawi, 85 AH, who ordered the transfer of chemistry books to Arabic, or crafts books, in the popular term among them. The narratives say that Khalid learned this science from a person called Marinus, or Marianus, who had learned the craft from Stephen, who lived in the time of Heraclius, immediately before the Islamic conquest. Chemistry had 2 purposes, one of them is to transform base metals into gold, and the second is to perform chemical processes related to industries, such as making dyes, metal casting, manufacturing weapons. Translation era. You may ask, where is philosophy in all of this? Yes, where is the philosophy? Al-Farabi asked this question, and he said in the answer, as we mentioned at the beginning of this book, that the word philosophy is foreign and came from Greece. In the 1st century AH, the Arabs were not yet concerned with transmitting philosophy. because their interest, as it became clear to us, was only in science. The transmission of philosophy was incidental, not original. This is because the Greek philosophers combined philosophy and science, and the observer of their sciences was obliged to know their philosophers, each of whom mastered a certain science, especially their notables such as Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Empedocles, Democritus, Pythagoras, and others. Thus, it was necessary for the student of science to expand into knowledge of philosophy and become acquainted with its doctrines and the biographies of philosophers and the connection between philosophy and science. The era of translation, in the true sense of the word, began during the time of the Abbasids. Al-Mansur al-Abbasi established the city of Baghdad, which was destined to be the bride of the East and the heart of Islam for a long period of time. Then he summoned from Jundisapur Jorgis bin Baktishu in the year 148 AH, and appointed him as its chief physician, where he remained until he died in the year 150 AH. Al-Mahdi summoned his son Baktishu and served him an Al-Hadi and Al-Rashid. His son Gabriel also excelled and became a doctor to Jafar al-Bamaki, and continued until the time of Al-Ma'mun, and he died during his caliphate in the year 213 AH. Thus, the center of the cultural movement, philosophical and scientific, moved from Jundisapur to Baghdad, and in the year 215 AH, Al-Ma'mun established a translation institute called the House of Wisdom, and appointed for it presidents assisted by Nahari scribes, who knew the Syriac and Greek languages in addition to their proficiency in Arabic. One of the most famous people who assumed the presidency of the House of Wisdom was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who was fluent in Greek and was said to have memorized Homer's poetry and sang it in the streets of Baghdad. Caliph al-Mutawakkil appointed him to translate, and arranged for him assistants such as Istanfan bin Basil, Hubaysh, Musa al-Tarjuman, and others translate, and Hunayn browses through their translation to revise it. He quoted Galen's books on medicine, and he himself wrote articles on medicine. He also quoted Aristotle's books on logic, philosophy, and psychology. His method of translation was to convey the meaning, not the word. Ibn Ishaq excelled after him, and he also took charge of translation. The translation movement continued throughout the 3rd century, and books were translated more than once. When it was first quoted, it was not good. Because it adheres to the literal meaning rather than the meaning, it is transmitted in a second, better transmission, and sometimes it is transmitted in a 3rd transmission. Thus, most of the foreign heritage was transferred. We mention some of the most important scientific books that played an important role in the history of Islamic philosophy, as well as philosophical books. The scientific books. We begin with arithmetic and geometry. We say that the Arabs were interested in the book, Principles, written by Euclid, the master of geometry, who lived in the 3rd century BC. He excelled in Alexandria in the time of Ptolemy and wrote his book in 13 articles, the first 6 of which were on geometry, and the 7th to 10th articles were on arithmetic or numerical science. This book remained the mainstay of Alexandrian mathematicians until the emergence of Islam, when it was transmitted and explained. It began to be transmitted during the time of Al-Rashid, and was retransmitted during the Caliphate of Al-Ma'mun. Sarton says in his book, Ancient Science and Modern Civilization, 1, the Islamist study of the book Al-Usul began with Al-Kindi, which indicates the philosopher's interest in this book and the influence of philosophy on it. The last person to famously explain his engineering articles was Nasir al-Din al-Juzi. It is not surprising that mathematics is considered part of philosophy. Philosophy included all other sciences. Look at the book Introduction to Numerology by Nicomachus, an Alexandrian scholar in the 1st century AD, which was transmitted by Thabit ibn Qurra. You will find that he begins his book by defining philosophy, saying, the ancients who followed the path of knowledge of certain truth began with Pythagoras to define philosophy as Greek language, too. From this book, the Ikhwan al-Safa derived their first treatise on the science of numbers, thus linking this mathematical science with philosophy. The Alexandrians used to divide the mathematical sciences, and they called them the sciences of teachings, into 4 sections: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, a group that became known in the Middle Ages as the quadrivium, which the student of knowledge should have acquired in addition to the triple group trivium, which is grammar, rhetoric, and logic. But the Arabs had a different view of the tripartite group, which Al-Farabi called the science of linguistics. We will present it when talking about Al-Farabi or when talking about the classification of sciences. As for astronomy, the book that became famous among the Arabs is Almagest, written by the scholar Ptolemy. Ptolemy lived in the 2nd century AD, and the Arabs transmitted his book in the era of translation, and carved the word Almagest from Greek words whose origins the modern scholars differed. 3 But Latin Europe took the name of the book from Arabic and said Almagest, which indicates the high status of the Arabs in civilization. Ptolemy is the one to whom the idea of the Earth being stationary and the Sun rotating around it is attributed until Copernicus came and disagreed with him and brought about the famous revolution in the history of astronomy that the Earth is what revolves around the Sun, a revolution known as the Copernican Revolution, which was so famous that Kant, the German philosopher, likened his revolution to in philosophy there. There is no doubt that investigating this Earth that we inhabit, its position in the sky, and whether it is truly the center of the universe, given that man, who inhabits it, is the most honorable of beings, is all among the investigations that strike at the heart of philosophy, and which preoccupy the mind even today. Al-Kifti praised this book in Akbar al-Hukam, and made it one of 3 books that completely encompassed its art. He said, "No book is known to have been written on any of the sciences, ancient or modern, that included all of that knowledge and encompassed parts of that art except 3 books. One of them is this book Almagest on the science of astronomy and the movements of the stars, the second is the book of Aristotle on the science of making logic, and the third is the book of Sibawayh al-Basri on the science of Arabic grammar." It was not Ptolemy who invented this science, but rather it was an episode in the history of Greek thought that represents its crown, that thought that relied for its origins on the knowledge of the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians. When the Arabs came, they not only learned from Ptolemy, but they also learned from Indian and Persian astronomy. This is because the Caliph al-Mansur al-Abbasi, after he founded Baghdad, became interested in astronomy, and he was motivated to do so by the fact that one of the astronomers was part of the Sind delegation that came to Baghdad in the year As for medicine, the books of Hippocrates and Galen were translated, and they were the basis on which Arab doctors and philosophers relied. Just as the Arabs advanced the mathematical sciences and added to them, so they did with medicine, especially at the hands of Ibn Sina in his book, The Law. They added a new organization to this science, and innovations based on experience. Just as some of their philosophers based their philosophy on mathematics, such as Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi, others based their philosophy on medicine, such as Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd. This is because philosophy at that time included all the sciences, so it was not strange for Arab philosophers to encompass all the sciences circulating in their time. After all, philosophy is nothing else but a method of thinking that a person follows in order to achieve the truth, and a person acquires this method from practicing the sciences. If he works in mathematics, he takes the path of mathematical proofs, and if he is concerned with the natural sciences, his path is through observations, experiments, observing events, and deducing the laws that govern them. Hence, the methods of philosophers differed according to their scientific tendencies. Al-Kindi or al-Biruni, due to their reliance on mathematics, had this color in their philosophy, and Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, who were both doctors, had a more natural than mathematical approach to their philosophy, and this is a statement we send in the interest of generality and generality, but if we want accuracy and detail, we may find a philosopher who combines the two methods. Like Ibn Sina, who laid the foundation for the experimental method and detailed the rules of experimentation in the introduction to the Law, yet he was also a mathematician. Rather, he ended up fabricating a Sufi method at the end of his life, which we see clearly in his book, The Signs. The Wisdom Sciences. We mentioned how philosophy at that time included all the sciences, meaning the mathematical and natural sciences, without going into detail about that. Our purpose in this discussion is not to address the Arab division of sciences. This is a topic, even if it is included in the history of Islamic philosophy. However, it does not concern us here except to the extent that it supports the point of view that we defend, which is that this philosophy was based first and foremost on science. We remember some of what was mentioned in one of the letters of the main Sheikh, Ibn Sina, called, On the Sections of the Intellectual Sciences. He said that he defines wisdom as an art of thought from which a person can benefit from attaining in himself what he owes the entirety of existence, and what he must gain from what he must do so that his soul may be honored and perfected, and become a rational world comparable to the existing world, and prepare for the utmost happiness in the afterlife, according to human energy. This is a well-known Sino definition of philosophy, which we quoted in full because we will benefit from it in the following chapters. It is clear that Ibn Sina makes wisdom synonymous with philosophy, which according to him is divided into two parts: theory and practicality. Theory's goal is truth, and the process's goal is good. The theoretical wisdom is divided into three sections: natural sciences, mathematics, and theology. This last science is called metaphysics in the French language. There are three categories of practical wisdom: ethics, home economics, and politics. Natural wisdom is both original and secondary. The original has 8 sections, each section of which is explained by a book that is considered a main focus on its topic, which are, ye heard the entity, the sky and the world, the universe and corruption, and the first part of the Al-Athar, which explains the phenomena of meteors, clouds, thunder, earthquakes, and other things, and the fourth article of the Al-Athar book, which is related to minerals, the book of plants, the book of animals, and the book of the soul. The natural subsidiary wisdom is medicine and astrology, which is different from astronomy or physical science, is, as Ibn Sina defines it, a speculative science, the purpose of which is to infer from the shapes of the planets by measuring one another, by comparing them to the degree of the zodiac, and by measuring all of that to the earth according to the conditions of its cycles. The world, the king, the kingdoms, the countries, the births, the transfers, and the arrangements. Then the science of physiognomy, and the science of expression, and the purpose therein is to infer in wise imaginings what the soul has seen of the knowledge of the unseen, so its imaginative power is imagined by the example of others. Talismanology, Nisms, and chemistry. We have previously mentioned the 4 categories of original mathematical wisdom: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, and it also has many numerical and geometric branches. Divine science, or metaphysics, investigates the origins of naturalists and mathematicians, proves the existence of God, proves spiritual essences, and other things that fall within the science of metaphysics. It is clear that Ibn Sina follows the example of Aristotle and his Alexandrian commentators in dividing the sciences and considering them as branches of the tree of philosophy. He also follows the example of Aristotle in considering logic as a tool for science, and therefore he allocated a special section of wisdom to it, and did not adopt it as part of the totality of theoretical wisdom. But he differs fundamentally from the logician, that is, Aristotle, when he makes among the branches of divine sciences the knowledge of the descent of revelation, the knowledge of the resurrection, and the related happiness and misery in the afterlife, and revelation, resurrection, and resurrection in the afterlife are religious, not philosophical, sciences. We believe that Al-Khwarizmi in Mafati al-Ulam was more correct in his division of sciences than Sheikh al-Ray. This is because Al-Khwarizmi separates religious sciences from the pure and philosophical sciences, which he calls non-Arab sciences. Al-Farabi did the same in his book, Statistics of Sciences, and Ibn Khaldun went to this in the introduction. He divided the sciences into two large sections. Rationalism is the science of wisdom and philosophy, in which he followed the example of Ibn Sina, and traditional, legal, or religious. We are then faced with two basic types of sciences that may diverge to the point of dissonance, or they may converge to the point of compatibility and integration, namely philosophy and religion. We will present the problem of reconciling the Islamic religion and philosophy later, because this issue is considered one of the main issues in the history of Islamic philosophy. But what concerns us at the present time is the decision on the issue that we have explained and tried to support. Philosophical books. We did not elaborate on the scientific books that were transmitted, because our purpose is not to research the history of science, but rather the history of philosophy. Rather, we mention some of the most important scientific books, as well as the movement of translating the various sciences, given that these knowledges were not separate, because philosophy contained within it the sciences and considered them as branches of it. But as we review the history of philosophy in Islam, we have no escape from mentioning other philosophical books. The Arabs were concerned with transmitting various doctrines, from Plato, from Aristotle, from the Stoics, and from the philosophers of Alexandria. However, the philosopher who won the largest share of transmission, and who was destined to remain and influence Islamic thought more than others, is Aristotle, and his philosophy is known as Peripateticism. Before we mention his translated books, we say, there is a difference between Aristotelianism and Peripatetics. Aristotelianism is the doctrine of Aristotle in particular, and it does not go beyond his school or his commentators, and the Peripateticism is the doctrine of this school that was founded by Aristotle, and his writings remained the beacon that illuminated the way for it from the 4th century BC, until the time of Ibn Rushd in the 13th century, and it was called Peripateticism because, it is said, Aristotle taught he walks and his followers walk around him. In fact, this method was not specific to Aristotle alone. Rather, it is also what was said by Socrates and the owners of Ulriwak, but if Peripateticism is used, it does not mean anything other than the school of Aristotle. Islamic philosophy took a peripatetic rather than Platonic approach. It is known that Aristotle, in his youth, composed dialogues similar to Plato's dialogues, and then changed them to an organized composition. He wrote in all sections of philosophy, and he completed and published some books during his life. Like the book Ethics, but many of his other books were nothing more than notes from which he delivered his lessons, and he had not prepared them for publication, and they were not arranged in this now known order of beginning with logic, then physics, then metaphysics. This publication and this arrangement were the work of Andronicus after 3 centuries after Aristotle's death. Andronicus was curator of the Library of Alexandria. There are 6 logical books: categories, phrase, analogy, proof, argument, and sophistry. Then the Arabs added 3 books to it. One is considered an introduction to the categories, and its name in Greek is isagogi, meaning introduction or introduction. It is the work of Porphyrius of Tyre, a student of Plotinus. This book examines the 5 universals, which are sex, gender, class, private, and public presentation. As for the other 2 books, they were attached to the end of logic, namely rhetoric and poetry. This is because the Arab philosophers did not understand Aristotle's purpose in these 2 books, which were appropriate to the nature of the Greeks in the 4th century BC, when democracy was the basis of their political life in particular, and they needed the craft of rhetoric to overcome opponents and support political and social opinions. Their rhetoric was not like that of the Arabs, which relied on eloquence and statement, and relied on what the Arabs call eloquence. It had other purposes than the Greeks. In addition, Greek rhetoric was considered an art, in the true sense of art. The same is true of poetry. According to Aristotle, it is the feature that distinguishes all arts, whether that art is sculpture, photography, pure music, a lyric poem, an epic, or a drama. In other words, every beautiful art is poetry. The finest arts are comedies and tragedies, and the finest of all are tragedies. The Arabs did not know this representational art, but they stopped at lyric poetry. Then the Arabs looked at the book of poetry in terms of its connection to philosophy, which they saw as the request for truth, and that this request might be certain if it came through proof, or dialectical if it came through argument, or rhetorical if it relied on well-known opinions, or poetic if it came through debate. It came about imaginings, and moving from similarity to similarity, and this is the weakest degree of the argument. Hence, they added the books of rhetoric and poetry to logic. Thus, the logical books of the 9 late Arab philosophers were completed. As for the earlier ones, they mentioned only 4 books that are considered the basis of logic, which are categories, expressions, analogy, and proof. Whoever is ignorant of them has ignorant of logic. It is worth noting that the Arabs first knew these books by their Greek names, and they said, isagogi, categorias, perieminias, first analogia, second analogia, tuica, sophitica, rhetorica, and boetica. Some of these names have remained to the present time. Al-Azhar, for example, still teaches the book Isagogi, even though what Al-Azhar means by this term is other than the entrance only. Look at the word sophistry that was introduced into the Arabic language. You will find that its origin is the Greek study of logic, which indicates the influence of Greek thought on Arab thought. There is no surprise in that the Arabs, by virtue of their expansion between the East and the West, took from here and there, transferred from different civilizations, preserved this entire heritage for a long time, added new knowledge to it, and so on. This is because humanity is an indivisible whole, and the civilization that man has achieved at the present time is not the result of the effort of one nation, but rather the result of the interaction of different civilizations throughout the ages. The Arabs copied all of his natural books from Aristotle's books, and we do not need to mention them again. We referred to it when talking about the division of the sciences of original natural wisdom according to what Ibn Sina mentioned. They also quoted the book, Beyond Nature, which is called the Book of Letters. Because it is located in several articles, arranged according to the letters of the Greek alphabet. The most famous of these articles is the article on Olam, which discusses God, who, according to Aristotle, is the mover who does not move. Ibn Rushd explained this book paragraph by paragraph, article by article, in his book, The Interpretation of Metaphysics. It would be appropriate for us to stop at a book that was wrongly attributed to Aristotle, and that error was the cause of much confusion in Islamic philosophy, and by that we mean the Book of Ethology or Deism, which was transmitted by Ibn Naima al-Homsi, and corrected by Yaqub al-Kindi. The book is actually by Plotinus, not Aristotle. There is a great difference between the doctrine of the two philosophers. Because Aristotle's philosophy is based on existence, and Plotinus' philosophy is based on the one. Al-Farabi realized this error and doubted the book's attribution to Aristotle. Whatever the case, the ingenuity of the Arabs in reconciling these two foundations was able to combine the metaphysics of existence with the metaphysics of the one, and they emerged from that with a new philosophy that combined them, which is considered an original innovation in Islamic philosophy. But where is Plato, where is his philosophy, and where are his dialogues? The Arabs transferred some of them. They transferred the Republic and called it the Utopia, and they quoted from it and were influenced by it, as we see in The Utopia by Al-Farabi. They also quoted the book Al-Nawamis and were influenced by it, and Al-Kifti mentioned the names of his dialogues, saying, he used to name books after the men who requested them, and they were in various fields, including the Book of Laches on Courage, the Book of Charmides on Chastity, etc. It seems that the method of dialogue in composition was not familiar to the Arabs, especially since the Platonic dialogues were not just a dialogue between people, but they were actually represented until the time of Cicero, and in addition to that, they are filled with Greek myths that mention the gods, which the Muslim Arabs do not want to mention. That is why most of Plato's dialogues were not transmitted, nor were they popular with Islamic philosophers. Hence, they preferred peripateticism over Platonism. However, Islamic philosophy was not limited to the peripatetics of Aristotle only, but it took aspects of Platonism, Neoplatonism, Pythagoreanism, and Indian and Persian philosophy, and formulated from this entire heritage a new philosophy in the light of Islamic teachings. It will not be sufficient in this narrow space to mention all the philosophical books that had an impact on Islamic thought, such as the book, Pure Goodness, and others, and those seeking to expand on this topic should refer to the lengthy publications. We then move on to talk about the most famous Islamic philosophers in history, before we talk about the main problems they addressed. Footnotes 1. See this book, page 78 onwards, to know its Arab commentators. 2. Introduction to Numerology, Catholic edition, Beirut, 1958 AD. 3. See Nalino in his book, The History of Astronomy Among the Arabs, and his discussion of this name.